Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome. We're going to start. My apologies, we're 5 minutes late, but we're going to start now. I'd like first to welcome you and to thank you for being here. I'm just going to wait, people are walking in. My name is John Hollica, and I am part of the Gaza USD Coalition. It's a coalition of faculty and alumni, and we work in relationship with a student organization to develop this program, this teaching that is taking place at USD. It started in the fall semester and will continue throughout the semester. And I'll speak more about that. But I want to begin by acknowledging that I stand as a guest on the unceded land of the Kumeyaay people. And anywhere in this country, we stand as guests on the sovereign land of Native people. And I also want to acknowledge that as an immigrant to this country, I benefit from this long and cruel history of repression, of theft, of genocide that has been inflicted on the Native people. And as a Palestinian, I struggle with the irony of being both a settler and a Palestinian. So I'll talk a little bit about tonight's film, but let me first talk about the teaching. I'm happy to see a lot of you here, and a lot of students here is what I meant to say. I'm happy to see all of you here. And the teaching, the purpose of my teaching is to develop a series of educational programs that will inform our community of this complex topic of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the teaching started late last semester when the war in Gaza and in Israel started. I actually use the word cautiously because I don't think it's a war. I think it's a very unbalanced abuse of a large mass of humanity. We developed 3 events last semester, a lecture by Farid Al-Banur from San Diego State, and 2 panels discussions, one that explored different histories, overlapping histories of Zionism, and one that explored the ideas of 1-state, 2-state, and 3-state solutions. This semester, we plan to continue with a series of events, starting tonight with this film, 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. The co-producers, directors of the film will be with us in a bit, and they're going to talk afterwards. And I'm going to let them do most of the talking about the film. Next week, I'd like to invite you to come on Wednesday, the 28th, from 4 to 6 p.m. There's going to be a lecture by Professor Jonathan Graubart from San Diego State University Department of Political Science. He'll be talking about his new book titled Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariah. It's a really interesting book. It's a very complex book. It's a very timely book. There's also going to be a series of events starting in March 5th. There'll be a screening of the film Gaza Fights for Freedom. On March the 12th, there'll be a panel discussion that explores resistance and survival from various indigenous communities. And there'll be 4 panelists speaking. The spot hasn't been confirmed yet, but hopefully it'll be in this room. There'll be a number of other events, so please keep an eye out on the flyers. If you're on our mailing, if you're not on our mailing list and you'd like to be on the mailing list, please give me your name and I'll make sure that you're on the mailing list. So at the end of the film, Ahlam and Andy, the co-producers, will be here and they're going to talk for a bit about the film, and then we'll open the floor to questions. We will pass around, for anybody who wants questions when they're talking, a bunch of index cards, and you can please write your questions, and then we will read them. It'll be the most efficient way to do it. Does anybody have anything to say before we start the film? All right, thank you all.
There are no signs for them. You won't see them on tourist maps. But if you know where to look, if you remember where to look, you can find them, and hundreds like them across Israel.
كلها مهدمينها ورايحة. كيف؟ هذا بيتنا هون. هون بيتنا؟ هون. مش فاهم عليك. 100%. كيف؟ هون البيت.
To know the stories of these ruined towns and villages is to understand the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To learn their stories, you must go back to a year that none in the region will ever forget, though some have tried.
It's a black hole. I don't want to think about it.
The feeling of you have a state of your own, a Jewish state, no one have ever lived such a situation.
It's such a grave injustice, and that is really what hurts you. It's a grave injustice that has not been at all attended to and taken care of.
Only when I answered your question, I knew about it. Yes. I know that I don't want to think about 48.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict can seem impossible to comprehend. By looking at the year that most changed the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, 1948, it becomes possible to understand the forces that drive this conflict today. For Israelis, 1948 was a year of creation. The terrible injustices Jews had faced throughout the world would finally come to an end with the realization of their long sought-after solution, a Jewish state in Palestine. For Palestinians, 1948 was a catastrophe. That one year saw the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns, their inhabitants replaced by outsiders from Europe and Russia, and most Palestinians would never see their home again. In the 1800s, Jews across Europe and Russia suffered persecution in many forms. Racial stereotypes of Jews were rampant. Movements called for boycotting Jewish businesses. In many places, Jews were not allowed to attend universities, were forced to live in certain neighborhoods, and were prevented from entering roles in government. In other places, whole towns would rise up against their Jewish populations and attack them en masse, resulting in looting, robbery, rape, and massacres. Jews began to look for a way to end their suffering. Some came up with the idea to bring all of the Jewish people out of Europe and settle in a place where they could finally be secure. The place they chose was Palestine, and the movement, formed at the end of the 19th century, became known as Zionism.
We were Zionists. We were for building a homeland.
Well, what the Jews did in their little circles and societies abroad, which promoted Zionism, as it came to be called, is they gathered some money and then they sent off a family or a group of 20 people or whatever to Palestine, They bought little chunks of land and established small settlements.
הרוח הייתה בהחלט של רוח של תקווה ושל התלהבות והרגשה שפה בונים משהו.
Europeans had been colonizing land across the globe for centuries, and Zionism would follow in that tradition. But there was a problem that was overlooked by a popular Zionist slogan about Palestine.
A people without land for a land without people. Okay, so they wanted to give the Jews a land because they didn't have land. But the problem is that the land they gave them had people. It was inhabited by Palestinians for thousands of years.
When Zionist settlers began arriving in the 1880s, the Palestinian population already numbered around 450,000 Arabs and 20,000 Jews.
كانوا اليهود موجودين يهود حقيقيين من اليهود اللي غير متطرفين، يعني كانوا مستقيمين وكانوا يعرفوا إنه أنا إلي حق إني أعيش هون مثل ما إله هو حق يعيش هون.
لما أجوا هذول تبعين الغرب هن اللي خربوا الدنيا وهجرونا.
During World War I, the Zionist movement scored a major victory. The British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declared support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. A few weeks later, the British Army conquered Jerusalem and began implementing the Balfour Declaration. In the early years of the movement, calls for removing Arabs from Palestine were not often made publicly by Zionist leaders. But as larger and larger groups of Jews began arriving in the country, discussions about encouraging the native population to leave by purchasing their land or through other means began to spill into the open. In the 1920s, thousands of Arabs became homeless after Zionists purchased their land out from under them by making deals with wealthy landlords from nearby countries. The rise of Hitler in the 1930s led to a massive increase in Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Arabs watched the arrival of more and more Zionists, saw the growing number of those who had lost their homes, and heard pronouncements by some Zionist leaders that they had plans to one day outnumber the Arabs.
The Arabs revolted. In 36, 39, they revolted against the British and against the Zionist presence.
The leadership of the Zionist movement and the leadership of the Palestinian Arab population. They both have made the same diagnosis of their situation, and this is what they understand, that the establishment of any type of Jewish state in any part of Palestine where there was going to be a Jewish majority necessarily required the large-scale displacement of Palestinian Arabs.
Early Zionism thought you can actually buy the Palestinians out. You can buy bits of the land here, you push them out, gradually you push them into Transjordan. By the mid-30s, the key figures within the leadership realized the only way to do it is to do it on a mass scale, to engineer it.
In 1940, Yosef Weitz wrote in his diary, "The only way is to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries. All of them, except perhaps Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Old Jerusalem. Not a single village or a single tribe must be left." As the Second World War broke out, flight from Europe only became more desperate. Yosef ben Eliezer ended up in Palestine after being forced out of Poland by the Nazis.
We were ordered to go out from the town. The SS were standing around us, and mothers with children, old people, handicapped, everyone, the whole mass of people moving towards the River Seine. In there we were searched for all valuables, and they were taken away from us.
Poland, there were 25 children in my class. Two of us remained after the war. All the rest were killed.
I had a view that we are fighting for survival, and that if we will not fight, we will experience here a second Holocaust, which may have been not objective, but that's what I felt at the time.
In Palestine, even before World War II began, it was clear that war was on the horizon. After crushing the Arab revolt and exiling the leaders of the Arab community, the British decided to take some action to address the concerns of Arabs in Palestine.
And this pushed the British into gradually stopping Jewish immigration. What this meant to the Jews was that the path of achieving statehood through majority, through gaining a Jewish majority here, was blocked.
At the time, there were two Zionist militias in Palestine. The Haganah was far larger and better equipped, but the Irgun was more radical. The Irgun refused to accept the British decision to restrict immigration into the country.
So we started to fight against them.
My father was at the doorstep of the building and looked at his watch, and he said, "It's too early now. I'm going to come and have lunch at the YMCA anyway." Just as soon as he left, he hardly got away, a kilometer away, and the building was gone.
The King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British government in Palestine. Its bombing in 1946 by the Irgun was by far the largest attack in the Zionist campaign against the British and was a massive shock to Palestine. It left 91 people dead, including Britons, Arabs, and Jews.
My mother came to us and she said, go on your knees and thank the Lord that your father was spared.
In the 1940s, the Haganah began preparing for the coming war with the Arabs by creating files on the hundreds of Arab villages and neighborhoods across Palestine.
We used to spy, you might call it, on the Arab villages around to prepare ourselves for the day in which we knew will come, when the British leave, that the fight will not be against the British, but between the Jews and the Arabs. So we used to build up files of pictures and details about the villages so they can be attacked when the point will come. And as at the age of 18, even less 17, I was already part of such an operation.
In 1947, the British gave up on trying to find a solution between the Zionist settlers and the native population. Exhausted from World War II, the British declared that they would leave Palestine and handed the problem over to the United Nations. At the UN, a committee decided that the best way forward was to split Palestine in two, giving one state to the Jews and the other to the Arabs. Jerusalem would become a separate entity administered by the UN. The Jewish community in Palestine had skyrocketed throughout the Zionist movement. But in 1947, it still only represented 1/3 of Palestine's population and owned less than 7% of the land. The United Nations partition plan called for giving 56% of the country to the Jewish state. This proposal shocked the Arab community. Not only would the Jews receive over half of Palestine, but they were also receiving most of the land suitable for farming.
Nobody felt that this was a fair deal.
The overwhelming majority, more than 55% of a country that had a 2/3 Arab majority, was being given over to the minority. And the area that would have been given to the minority was almost equal in population between Arabs and Jews. So there was a negative reaction to the partition of the country at all. People felt it's a single country, it shouldn't be partitioned. But then the specifics of the partition were found unjust and unequal in that a minority was being given most of the country.
But in the wake of the Holocaust, world leaders felt compelled to do something for the Jewish people. In the United States, President Truman was facing re-election and intense lobbying by Zionist leaders. As a result of those pressures, he began supporting the UN partition plan.
Truman, you might say, unleashed American diplomats to threaten certain countries. So you change your vote or else. And it worked. The vote passed to have partition.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Partition passed, 33-13. And is this crowd excited? They're starting their horror dances now. All over the square, little circles are forming. People are laughing and crying and shouting and whirling around in the wild horror dance.
The only time I remember in my life that I really seen a total happiness. I mean, everyone was dancing and everyone was happy, and, because it was a dream fulfilled.
ההרגשה של היישוב כולו הייתה של שמחה גדולה מאוד. הייתי ברמת יוחנן, כן, כולם רקדו בחדר האוכל, אני אפילו לא יצאתי.
I disliked it. From the beginning, I disliked it.
כי ידעתי שאחרי ההחלטה הזאת העניינים לא יסתדרו ותהיה מלחמה.
And they said, we are not going to accept this, we're going to fight. Because this is our country and we're not going to leave it. And we're not going to let anybody take part of it even.
Jerusalem rioters started fires in many parts of the city. Casualties amount to more than a score killed on both sides. But Palestine's most critical period has yet to come. With British troops away from the trouble center, it remains to be seen whether a threatened full-scale war will materialize.
بدنا سلاح نقوم فيه. صار كل واحد يتبرع باللي عنده.
فكنا نطلع على الجبل نقابل وين بيه طريق يطلعوا منها اليهود علينا. وأنا من الناس اللي أخذوا بارودة طليانية مع 5 فشكات.
Now, when we came to a village, and then was a barrier of stones, I was afraid. I had all a bus on my responsibility. Then they began to try to climb on there, and I shot, and I hit maybe 3, 4, I don't know how many.
في يوم من الأيام إجت مجموعة يهود ودخلوا على البلد في الليل ولغموا بيوت ونسفوهن وقتلوا أهلهن. ومن هناك بدأت المعركة بين أهل البلد وبينهم يعني. فصاروا أهل البلد يشتغلوا أسلحة فاهم ويقاوموا.
Because the British ran the government of Palestine, neither the Jews nor the Arabs had an official army. However, by 1947, the Haganah, the militia of the mainstream Zionist parties, had become a well-developed force of 35,000 to 40,000 fighters, nearly 4 times more than the poorly equipped Arab militias.
The only Palestinian leader at the time was someone named Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. And he was quite effective in rallying people to his cause.
Oh, he was a force to be reckoned with. He had a big following. He was a fighter, a freedom fighter.
اليهود كانوا يعملوا انفجارات، احنا تعلمنا منهم الانفجارات.
صاروا يزتوا تفجيرات براميل يدحلوها من شارع يافا الأبين من فوق تيجي عنا يافا. فأخافت العالم. هذا الشيء اللي خوف العالم. صاروا يهربوا. قالوا
Haifa refinery was one of these rather rare cases where you had Jewish and Arab workers working together. So the Irgun members drove by the oil refinery one day and threw a bomb into a group, a rather large group of Palestinian Arab workers standing outside of the break. The Palestinians then responded against their fellow Jewish workers.
صار معركة في الشمالية هاي بالريفينري راح طرب من اليهود القتلة.
There was a revolt there, and the Arabs said about the Jewish workers. We got called out there. Terrible disaster. Bodies all over the place.
ואז יצאנו לפעולת תגמול, נקרא לזה, על כפר ערבי שנקרא בלד אל-שייח. ירינו, הם ירו עלינו, נהרג שם בחור על ידי ואני ועוד חבר הוצאנו אותו, לא היה לנו אפילו אלונקות אלא על הכתפיים.
the retaliation at Baladi Sheikh left dozens of Arab men, women, and children dead. It had been 4 weeks since the announcement of the UN partition plan. The British had announced that they would complete the evacuation of Palestine on the 15th of May. Zionist leaders began preparing for a Jewish state. On March 10th, the Haganah adopted Plan Dalet, also known as Plan D. This plan outlined an overall strategy for the Jewish militia. Its stated goal was to prepare the coming Hebrew state to defend itself once the British Army had left. But historians strongly disagree about the intentions of the plan.
It's geared, and it says that it's geared, to securing the Jewish state and the border areas and the main roads between the Jewish urban concentrations, to securing the Jewish state in advance of the Arab invasion.
It's completely ridiculous. I mean, it's very clear that Plan Dalet was a plan not just to take over, but to empty of their population all of these villages and cities. Now, were there people who understood that writing down on paper, we will expel this population, was probably not a wise thing to do? Yes. But was there a clear intention implemented to the letter to expel the populations, and more importantly, not to let them return? There was.
The most important part of Plan D was the set of orders that came outside of Plan D. The orders were strikingly clear and unambiguous, and used the word letaher in Hebrew, which is to cleanse, or to destroy, which is lehashmid, or to expel, which is legaresh. I think the role of the historian is to fuse these military orders with the plan itself, and then you get an idea of the intention and the implementation.
Under Plan D, the Haganah began organizing large-scale military operations. The first, Operation Nachshon, took place over 2 weeks in April. The goal of Nachshon was to end attacks on Jewish convoys by clearing out Arab villages on the road to Jerusalem.
The villages were defended in most cases by forces, maybe 30 people, 40 people, who were not trained, who were not organized, were not defended by any trenches or things like that. And the conquest in all the places that I participated was an easy game.
During Operation Nachshon, the Haganah captured the strategically located Arab village of Kastal. Arab fighters attempted to retake the village in a counterattack led by Abdel Qadir al-Husseini.
He came with a huge number of people, and they started to climb up the mountain. And so we shot one of us, I think it was Nelson. He killed Abdul Qadir by mistake. And we saw this man with a big kafia and his very elegant clothes, but we didn't know who he was. And then the Arabs made the biggest mistake in the War of Independence. Instead of taking the castle and keep the road closed, they went to Jerusalem to the funeral of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini.
كنا في القدس أنا وأبوي، والكل كان يبكي لأنه هذا رمز القضية الفلسطينية.
Just 2 miles from Kastal lay the Arab village of Deir Yassin. Early in the morning of April 9th, the same day as the funeral of al-Husseini, fighters from the Irgun set out for the village. Deir Yassin was one of many Arab villages that had signed a peace agreement with a neighboring Jewish village, so they did not expect an attack. The Haganah intelligence officer who reported on Deir Yassin was Mordechai Gichon.
Deir Yassin were only citizens. The village was completely peaceful.
أخوي رحمة الله عليه محمود ضرب، سمع الصوت ولا ضرب من هناك منطلق، ويعني 12 ساعة متتالية وهم يقاتلوا اليهود.
A number of Arabs died resisting the attack, but a far larger group lost their lives well after the battle had ended. In all, Jewish fighters killed about 110 Arabs at Deir Yassin, most of them women, children, and the elderly.
People were mutilated, Hand grenades were simply thrown into houses. Women and children were killed, bodies stuffed down wells, jewelry stripped off fingers, fingers cut off, earlobes cut off.
رحت أنا ماشي بعرق الحيط مش من الشارع الرئيسي، من البساتين. الفرن له شباك على ولا اليهود في الفرن، والنسوان قعدات على الأرض، وكل واحدة قاعدة وحاطة إيديها على راسها هيك، وبقولوا للفران ارمي ابنك بالفرن، ارمي ابنك بالفرن، اسمه حامد. قال لهم أنا ما برمي ابني. قال له شوي، هم ضربوا الحاج حامد على راسه ومسكوا الولد رموه بالفرن. أنا شفت هالمنظر، شفت هالمنظر ما تمش فيها حيل من مرة يعني. بعدين مسكوا الأب حطوه وراه، قالوا له الحق ابنك. أنا اجيت عديت قلت هلا بيمسكوني، قمت أركض.
After the massacre, they took the people which remained, they took them in a car and went through Jerusalem.
Irgun trucks full of survivors paraded up and down streets in Jewish neighborhoods. Spectators mocked, spit at, and even stoned the villagers.
It was very ugly. After these things, I did not know if I am a Zionist.
After the attack, the Haganah sent men to cover up the atrocities.
They came to me and gave me a platoon of soldiers and told me, go there and make order. And so I came there and I was shuddering because I see how the dead were strewn and they were eating sandwiches with marmalade. For some time I couldn't eat marmalade after that. And then I told them, look here, I'm going to fire and shoot and kill you if you don't clean this up. And so they made graves and buried them, and a few they threw in a well, and everything was apparently clean. And then everything looked peaceful.
But the massacre was not over. Some villagers remained in Deir Yassin, hiding in their homes. For 2 days, Irgun fighters searched for survivors.
مروا مرتين ثلاث ما عرفوش، والله ما شافونا، لولا الولد صار يبكي. أخذوا عزمي صرنا نبكي لأنه ولد أدنى. قال هذا بيبي رجعوه. كمان شباب صفوهم على الحيط حوالي 15 واحد ورشوهم قدامنا. احنا حملونا في بيك اب. لما وصلنا المنطقة اللي بين العرب واليهود طلع لي واحد عينين زرق حلو، شخصية محترمة، أبو 18 سنة. قلت له بالله عليك أنت عربي؟ قال لي تفضل ما تخافش أنتوا عند العرب هلأ.
Most of the images of the Deir Yassin massacre are in the archives of the Israeli army. The archive refuses to release many of the images and intelligence reports on Deir Yassin, despite being well past the 50-year embargo for classified documents.
Looking back, I'm still, after all those years, very much shocked, and I feel it is a disgrace on the Jewish state and of the Israelis.
مذبحة دير ياسين كانت هي الحافز الأكبر للقرى اللي تهرب بأولادها وأطفالها وبناتها ونسوانها.
قالوا أخذوا البنات يعني وفضعوا فيهن وسووا كذا وعملوا كذا. هذا اللي خلانا إحنا نشرد.
The massacre at Deir Yassin was far from the only massacre of the war, but it was the most widely publicized.
تسمع كل القرى في مذبحة دير ياسين.
دير ياسين، دير ياسين،
معركة دير ياسين، مزرعة دير ياسين.
دير ياسين، أحداث دير ياسين.
By far the most massacres, rapes, atrocities, etc., were committed by Israelis, particularly after 1948 independence, then by Palestinians or by Arabs.
The Jewish offensive continued.
The normal procedure was that the Haganah would begin by a short barrage of either light mortars or 3-inch mortars. Most these villages were within citrus orchards, so we could come closer by going between the trees of the orchards. As we deployed the width of the front with my platoon, say, in front of the houses, we gave a 1-minute coordinated shot of whatever weapons we had and stormed. And in at least 2 or 3 of these places, when we came into the houses, there was nobody there. There was still coffee on the pot. You could see people lived there until a few minutes ago. They ran into the orchards and hid there and waited to see what happens. And if they tried to come back, they were shot at.
Haifa was the second largest city in Palestine, and its port served as the main exit point for the evacuating British army. So there were a large number of British troops there.
Well, Haifa was a mountain town, straddled Mount Carmel. The Arab population tended to live down at sea level. So there was a lot of shooting going, sniping, rifle fire, and bombs and things.
واستمر القصف واستمرت الاشتباكات بيننا وبينهم لليهود. بهاي الفترة اليهود دمروا بيت المنجرة اللي كنت أروح ألعب عندها أنا، منجرة بيت حمود، دمروا البناية تبعتهم، دمروها، لغموها ودمروها. بتصور دمروها لأنه كانت أعلى من البنايات تبعت اليهود، فكان يطلع منها قنص واشتباك طاخ.
وجابوا سيارة مفخخة وحطوها على المطعم وفجروها، وراح 9 قتلى ويمكن حوالي 20 جريح. مثل شغلة هذه السيارة المفخخة هاي ما بنساها أنا، هاي كنت راح أروح فيها أنا.
إجا أبوي أخذنا كلياتنا، أنا وأخوي وولاد عمي وولاد عمتي، ما خلى حدا. يلا شو في؟ قال يلا سكرت المدرسة. أخذنا وإذا في اشتباكات بيننا وبين اليهود.
On April 19th, the British decided to pull out of downtown Haifa. Just hours after the withdrawal was complete on the 21st, the Haganah went into action.
The operation, with its very ominous name, cleansing the leaven. Leaven is the bread that is left before Passover, and as a Jew you are supposed to clean even the last crumb. Now, if you apply it to people, you understand that the idea is to cleanse every person who lived in Haifa.
The Jewish attack on Haifa was accompanied by a massive, indiscriminate bombardment by mortars. The Haganah also used loudspeaker trucks to broadcast recordings of shrieks, gunfire, explosions, and calls to flee for your lives. This tactic was used in many places by Jewish militias in 1948.
كانت تمشي دبابة ب4 عجال نشرت الأولاد الصغار يخافوا، الحريم تخاف، العالم تخاف، كله خداع، لأنه كانوا بس بدهم يخوفونا، يطلعونا، بدهم يطلعونا.
In Haifa, the Jewish attack continued. Unlike in other towns and villages, Haifa's mayor, Shabtai Levi, actually pleaded with the Arabs to stay.
And he said, don't leave, stay here. We want you here. You belong here. Don't leave.
But there's no reason for them to believe him. So you had one person pleading for them to say, but what they were hearing from all sides, and they had little to defend themselves with, was that they were going to be massacred.
This British intelligence report describes the attack on Haifa. There was considerable congestion outside the East Gate of hysterical and terrified Arab women and children and old people, on whom the Jews opened up on mercilessly with fire.
We went out near the Haifa airport, what we call the trade school bullet, and we could see these poor old families, convoys of them, Arabs, cars and vehicles all going up to Lebanon. Very, very sad.
صار يطلعوا بالبحر. احنا رحنا صرنا نجيب بالمراكب نجيب ناس من حيفا على عكا. اليهود عندهم زوارق حربية يضحكوا علينا. يضحكوا انه شو يعني طلقتين ثلاثة بروح له شيء كذا.
Prior to the war, Haifa had been home to 70,000 Jews and 65,000 Arabs. By May, all but 4,000 of the Arabs had fled the city.
We wanted to intervene in it, but we weren't allowed to. As simple as that. Simple as that.
The Arab city of Jaffa would be the target of the next Zionist offensive. Jaffa was immediately adjacent to the Jewish city of Tel Aviv and home to the other major port in Palestine.
When the clashes started, nobody was prepared to fight in Jaffa. No arms, no munition, no administration, no leadership, no organization.
وباستمرار في الليل إطلاق النار باستمرار من اليهود ومن العرب. يدخل جيب في وراء 4 مثلا جنود أو عسكر أو المهم معهم أسلحة. كان في منهم يطلق النار عشوائي على الشعب اللي في الطرق يعني هيك.
היינו הולכים לבית ספר וחוזרים, היינו הולכים ליד הקירות כדי, אני אומרת לך, לא להיפגע. והייתה פגיעה אחת ישירה בבית סמוך אלינו, שם נהרגה אישה ונפצעו כמה אנשים. וזה היה קרוב לחג הפסח של 48, אז פינו את כל השכונה וגם אותנו.
On the 25th of April, the Irgun launched a major offensive on Jaffa. It had been 2 weeks since Irgun fighters had committed the massacre at Deir Yassin.
I was a company commander on the attack of Jaffa. 600 warriors were in all. The first 2 days, it was a chaos.
Nearly all our neighbors left. I was 16 years old. I told my father, I'm not leaving from here. Why? I'm not leaving from here. We stay here. Either we die here or we live here.
On the first day of the attack on Jaffa, the Irgun commander, Amichai Paglin, had made his objectives clear. To prevent constant military traffic in the city, to break the spirit of the enemy troops, and to cause chaos among the civilian population in order to create a mass flight. On the third day, he succeeded.
يوم بنتساش يعني قعدنا بالجوع بدنا ناكل طلعنا تحت القصف الواحد فاضي ياخذ اكل ولا يهرب بروحه لما بكون نازل الشتاء زي الشتاء القذايف على البيت ايش فاضي يحمل الواحد ما قدرنا نحمل شيء يعني يلا مصريات يقدر يهربوا فيهم
4 or 5 mortars were down in front of our home in the old city of Jaffa. Then my father told me, what are you waiting for? It's only a matter of week time. We can go, we come back.
The people of Jaffa left half by force, I would say. The Egyptians used to bomb Jaffa again and again and again. People ran away. We also told from mouth to ear that if the Jews will enter, it will be a terrible slaughter. So they ran away. فرشتين والحفين وطلعنا بالمركب وكانت صاروا يضربوا علينا بال 120 على المركب كمان. في 75 عيلة 100 عيلة كانت.
ركبنا بالمركب قعدنا حوالي 3 أيام بالبحر.
Anwar Saka still remembers walking through Jaffa's streets before war broke out.
I used to see the ships, sometimes 30 to 40 ships outside the marina. When you go downtown, walking from the college for about 10 minutes, you go to the center of Jaffa, where you have the tower, the clock tower. Then you go down to a main street, a fashion street, where boutiques, fashionable boutiques existed. There were also in Jaffa cinemas. One of them was the Alhambra cinema. It's all constructed of white marble. Inside is all furnished with red carpets and red velvet.
Today, at his home in a refugee camp, Yusuf al-Arwadi still keeps a collection of documents to remind him of his life in Jaffa. After the Irgun attack, Jaffa's pre-war population of 75,000 Arabs would soon be reduced to just 4,100.
It's not easy when you found yourself in a moment, losing everything. Your family, your home, your business, your school, your past, everything, completely. And thrown out in the street to nowhere.
In late April and early May, the Haganah launched a series of additional operations across Palestine. In a few places, Arab fighters managed to organize a strong defense.
And there was one very crucial fight on San Simon, which is a monastery, Jerusalem. We fought and they were winning. Some of the wounded people were lying there on top of dynamites in case we have to withdraw. We cannot take all of them. They will kill themselves. And then at the end, there was something happened that no one knows what. And they started to withdraw. And that saved Jerusalem.
The Jewish settlements that made up the Etzion block south of Jerusalem fared much worse. An Arab assault destroyed all 4 settlements. 129 Jews died, many of whom were massacred after their surrender. It would be the worst Jewish defeat of the war. But by and large, the final weeks of the British Mandate went in favor of the Jews. By mid-May, 250 to 400,000 Arabs had fled their homes. Between a third and half of all refugees who would leave Palestine during the war left before the British completed their evacuation on May 14th. That same day, the Zionist dream became reality as David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish people in Palestine, read the Declaration of Independence.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
With the declaration of the state, the Jews of Palestine would now be called Israelis. The Arabs of the country would continue to refer to themselves as Palestinians. Massive celebrations broke out in Tel Aviv, but many Israeli fighters had a different reaction.
In the declaration of the state, I was not happy. I did not dance, yes, and I said it will be trouble.
With refugees pouring into their countries, Arab leaders could no longer ignore the crisis in Palestine. The day after the British left, units of the Egyptian, Jordanian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Lebanese armies entered the war.
There was a strong sense of fear. We knew that we don't have airplanes, we don't have tanks yet.
This week's news includes pictures in Palestine taken from the Arab side. They show troops of the Arab Legion consolidating gains in a Jewish district of Jerusalem, where much of the heaviest fighting in recent days took place. Fires continued to add to the very considerable destruction already caused in the city, and at this time, at any rate, there seemed little prospect of calling a halt to the Arab-Jewish war.
It turned out now that there was one period in the war in which the Arabs had a superiority of power, and that was in May, when the Arab armies invaded Palestine and had weapons for which we didn't have an answer. But the general notion among Israelis, especially veterans of my age, the whole war was like that.
But if you calculate, as we did, the number of troops just in the Palestine theater, there are more Israeli fighters than there were Arab fighters.
The armies that these states had were very small, and they were poorly trained, because these states had been occupied by European powers, either the British or the French. The best troops were the Jordanian troops, the Arab Legion. Abdullah of Transjordan had made a deal. He wanted the West Bank, what had been allotted to the Palestinians in the UN plan. He wanted that for himself. And he promised then not to attack, and the Zionists agreed with that. Except for the battle for Jerusalem, which was to erupt, the Israeli army didn't really have to worry that much about a Jordanian attack. They could focus on the Iraqis, the Lebanese, the Syrians, who themselves were divided, and the Egyptians.
I don't think any one of the military commanders in the Arab world had any illusion that they would be able to defeat the Jewish state. But of course, to the public, they told that they would take Tel Aviv and so on. But I think that they were quite realistic people, and they knew the balance of power as anyone else among the leaders knew.
The intervention of the Arab armies did not stop the attacks on Palestinian Arab towns and villages. The next day, Israelis began their final assault on the town of Acre. Palestinians poured into boats to flee the attack.
قمنا الصبح لقينا عكا محتلة. والله طلعت لقيت مخ جوزي ومخ ابن عمي على الدرج. ويشهد الله. أنا ساعتها ما عاد شيء وحيد.
It was the first time I saw the ugly part of the war. Until then, war was dangerous, but it was not ugly.
في بنت عند خالها. أنا ما شفت، بس أبوي وأمي شافوا. قالوا اليهود فاتوا افتعلوا فيها. وقتلوا خالها، ليش خالها حكى قتلوه. ولما صوتها تصرخ وخالها كلهم خافوا من الله ويصيح، أنا صرت أنتق، كل أبوي يابا وطي صوتك يابا لا يجوا كمان، بكفي راحوا جزانك أحسن ما يجي يابا يفعل فيك، وأبوي عمره 70 سنة. ولي زمان ما سمعت النزر فيه. وبكل محنات عدى اللي والبريق بكل فنجان تا منه انتهى. أخليكي قد ما عادش فيه.
We went and we were moving around this village, Aquant. The door was open and we entered. Under the table there was a pair of small shoes. They were eating and then somebody told them to go away quickly. He didn't have time to put on the shoes on the baby. This part of the war, I have seen it the first time. This war is not a war of soldiers, it's a war of people, of children. And I started crying. The child needs his shoes. We need to send the shoes to the child. Where can he be?
The United Nations called for a truce. It began on the 11th of June.
We were very, very, very happy. And we hope that we will not fight later on.
During the first truce, the Arabs didn't do very much, whereas the leaders of the new state of Israel were extremely energetic in recruiting more troops, in training them, and most importantly, in illicitly importing arms from the Eastern Bloc, especially in Czechoslovakia.
The truce ended on the 8th of July. The following day, Israel began Operation Danny. This operation targeted Ramla and Lydda, the two Palestinian towns that remained in central Israel and home to the international airport.
This was a very strategic area, wheat fields, very fertile grain area, and you had incoming Jewish refugees. So you wanted that land not only as territory, the buildings, but you wanted the food.
Just outside of Ramla is this mansion, where as a child, Mazen el-Khairi used to visit his grandfather.
And I remember the garden in Wadi Hnain. The dahlias were so big. One of my uncles had peacocks. Yeah. And it was the jolly old times, as they say.
At the outset of the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Moshe Dayan took a column of vehicles and sped through Lydda, shooting at anything that moved. They left the streets strewn with the bodies of men, women, and children, around 200 in all.
And the place was conquered easily because the Arab Legion only put there one company which left in the middle of the battle. And it was only the semi-regular, untrained, unweaponed local Arabs that had to defend. But a few hours after the conquest, apparently by mistake, a small group of 4 or 5 Jordanian armored cars burst into Lod, turned around and went back. The Lod people thought that the Arab Legion at long last comes to defend them and rose up with their own weapons. As a result, the Palmach people started to shoot around wantonly.
The next morning, around 250 more Palestinians lay dead. Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, went to Operation Danny headquarters to meet with its commanders, Yigal Allon and Itzhak Rabin. They asked Ben-Gurion what should be done with those who remained in Ramla and Lydda. According to Rabin, Ben-Gurion waved his hand in a gesture that said, "Drive them out." Shortly thereafter, Rabin issued orders for expulsion.
Well, they came into each house at gunpoint, you leave. Each family was taken outside their houses on the street, and then we had to walk into sort of gathering areas.
ואז ברגע מסוים כנראה החליטו לגרש את הערבים משם. וגירשו אותם. ואנחנו ראינו את זה, כי הם עברו בדיוק על ידינו, על יד המשלט שלנו. אנחנו היינו במשלט שנקרא דיר אבו סלאמה, וכל השיירה הזאת עברה על ידינו.
Now we were sitting in Birzeit one afternoon, and then I watched the people of Ramle and Lidda coming, walking all the way from Ramle. It was such a sad, sad sight and very, very distressing.
We were lucky. They put us in a bus, not a truck. And we were driven to the border, and they started shooting over our heads to make us run.
Suddenly I seen those masses of people going through the checkpoint which we were commanded to man. And they were searched for valuables. And that reminded me very much the time when I was a child. We're starting to do the same thing people have done to us as Jews.
We were shocked to see these floods of people, sort of. I mean, waves and waves. I was sitting in my room up on a second floor. We couldn't believe we had to run down and see what was happening.
אנחנו היינו, לא רק אני, כולנו היינו בדיכאון. אנחנו פשוט נזכרנו בגלות שלנו. זה לא... אנשים הולכים לגלות, זה היה מראה מאוד קשה. וכולנו היינו בשוק. זה היה מראה קשה מאוד.
Everybody, I mean, the school, the church opened their doors, and my aunt opened the storeroom. Whatever we had, whatever was there, we just started boiling eggs, boiling potatoes, making salad, and whatever. And they came just so exhausted. Some of them were even not coherent. The children died on the road. They couldn't cope with the walk. It was a very, very traumatic experience, a sight that I'll never forget.
There were Arabs standing between Lud and Ramle and crying. They want to get back to their homes, and I could do nothing. And I felt very strongly about it because I saw them standing there, no shoes, and now they have to start walking and looking for someplace else. Then came the night, and at night, I don't know how many, 15 or 16 or maybe 10, I can't remember, trucks full of people that just came on the ship from the Holocaust. And they took over the town in 5 minutes. And so the whole tragedy was there in one moment. Here are the Arabs who used to live there, and here people who come from the Auschwitz and Majdanek and all that. And they won, they took the city. And the Arabs had to go to Nablus and to Jenin and it's not that it's right or wrong, but it's just a fact.
Prior to the Israeli attack, 50 to 70,000 Palestinians were living in Ramla and Lidda. Now, only hundreds remained.
They took the elder member of the family. He was maybe at the time, maybe he was 70 years old, and the soldier took his wallet. I remember this very, very well. So, anyway, they took more than the wallet, they took everything.
While Israeli soldiers outnumbered Arab soldiers, there were places where Arab armies concentrated their forces and fought fierce battles. Some of the largest battles were fought against the Egyptians in the south of the country. Kibbutz Yad Mordechai had fallen to the Egyptians in late May, and in July, a major battle broke out when the Egyptians attempted to take an Israeli kibbutz called Negba.
On our side, there was a time when I think there were maybe 10 people still unwounded. in the trenches. One after another, the machine guns stopped working. And there is so beautiful sight. Egyptian infantry advancing on us in a line, like in a movie. And we still had 2 or 3 machine guns working, so they never reached us. We stopped them about 100 yards from us.
In the north, Israeli units launched Operation Dekel. The main target was the large Christian town of Nazareth. But like most Israeli operations, Dekel also targeted Palestinian villages nearby.
وهاجمون اليهود من طريق حيفا ونحن ما عنا نقدر لا حدا يساعدنا من الناصري ولا حدا قدر يجي ولا فاضطرينا انه قاومنا احنا هربنا تحت السلاح دخلنا الحرش وحتى قدرنا نطلع سالمين يعني حتى في أحد منا تصاوب.
Soon after, Israeli troops captured Nazareth. The next day, the Israeli army issued an order to the commander of Operation Dekel to expel the population. The commander was actually a Canadian World War II veteran, Ben Dunkelman. He had flown to Israel in the spring of 1948 to fight alongside fellow Jews. But Dunkelman reported being shocked and horrified by the order to expel the people of Nazareth. He refused to carry it out.
There were 2 problems for that operation. One was Nazareth was full of refugees from villages that were already evicted. So the military commander realized that he would have to evict not only the people of Nazareth, but twice the number. He also realized that the world was watching because of the sacredness of the city to the Christian world.
Dunkelman's argument convinced the Israeli leader, David Ben-Gurion, to allow the people of Nazareth to stay. However, Dunkelman was removed from his newly appointed position as military governor of the town. And when Ben-Gurion later visited Nazareth, he looked around in astonishment and asked the Israeli officers, "Why are there so many Arabs? Why didn't you expel them?" The second truce of the war began 10 days after the end of the first. This truce officially lasted 3 months, but while fighting slowed down, it did not stop. The village where Mustafa Abu Ziyad lived was one of the targets of the largest military operation during the truce.
إنه الليل الساعة كذا وكذا بالمناشير نزلت طيارة والله إني شايفها طيارة حربية. انذار كافي كذا 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 الليل الساعة 11 اطلعوا مع شارع عرعرة على شارع على عرا وعرعرة واللي بيطلع ما يتلفتش لا شمال ولا يمين وإذا بروح هيك ولا هيك عن الشارع بروح بموت.
They usually surrounded the village and left one road open, prevented people from going in any direction except in one direction toward the closest Arab state.
مأساة الشعب الفلسطيني في هذاك اليوم.
In October, the truce came to an end and fighting resumed.
By this time, all the Arab armies had been pretty much defeated, and the Israeli army was the dominant force.
The Israeli army focused on clearing out villages in the 2 parts of the country where Palestinians remained, the Galilee in the north and the Negev desert in the south. Hava Keller arrived in the town of Beersheba in the Negev shortly after it was captured by the Israelis on October 21st.
And we came, wonderful, you came just on time. And tomorrow we are throwing out the Arabs from Beersheba. You are going to help. Of course, I'm going to help. The next day I got our gun. We prepared several buses. I think there was 10 or 12 buses. And we called all the Arabs from Beersheba to come to the buses. And I was standing like everybody with a gun, So nobody will try to run away, and all of them will go into the cars and go to Gaza. And they are in Gaza today, until today.
Nobody had an idea that this is a complete expulsion. It's a kind of war which will stop one day and you go back home. Wars happened all over the world. Towns have been occupied. Countries have been occupied. When the war was over, people got back home. Why should we be different?
Were this just an accident of war, then that accident of war would have been repaired within a few months of the implementation of Plan Dalet by the return of these people to their villages. They were not allowed to return.
החודשים האחרונים של המלחמה היו ניסיונות לא לחזור אולי, אבל להסתנן, לקחת ציוד וכן הלאה.
هلا بعد ما هالخمس 6 اشهر 7 اشهر المصاري اللي مطلعينها خلصت والبلد فيها الشغل واواعينا اللي لابسينها مزعت. شو بدنا نعمل؟ الله ابوي لامي قال لها نازل على فلسطين، كيف بدك تنزل؟ قال لها نازل ونازل على الكابري. إذا رجعت بعد يعني 15 يوم رجعت، ما رجعت بتكون انقتلت.
Then one day we got an order to take the jeeps and spread out and to shoot every Arab whom we saw coming back. And this is what happened.
The thinking behind this was political but essentially strategic. The Arabs, refugees who had been fighting, they were the Palestinians who had been fighting against the Jews. And they said if we allow these back, they will overwhelm us as a fifth column, or they will overwhelm us demographically. In other words, there will be hundreds of thousands of additional Arabs, and they will become a majority or close to a majority instantly if they return. So the Israeli cabinet decided not to allow them back.
We now must conclude that there was a recognition, at least on the part of that early Israeli government, that the displacement of Palestinians was necessary for what they probably viewed as the viability of their state.
For me personally, it took the shape of an inner decision of myself. You wanted a war, okay. Now you run away, you'll never come back. So the notion of having this land empty of Arabs was already part of my life.
وأمي تبكي وتقول إن خلاص يعني ما في أمل، قتل ومات.
It was a kind of manhunt in a way. I was very happy when Arab made it and disappeared beyond the hill.
I was lying in an ambush. These were Palestinians who came back to the fields to reap the harvest. And one of them was going in the front to make sure that the road is open. And I was lying across the road with a revolver in my hand. And as he approached me, I stood up, and he was a meter from me. He was so frightened that he embraced me. Then I became frightened. I didn't know what he has, a weapon, a revolver, a knife. So I shot at him. And that's a very strange experience. He fell to the ground from my hands. So I was killing a man point blank, just right there. I didn't blame myself. I didn't have any feeling of remorse because I had no chance. I had to do it. It was only natural that I should have reacted the way I reacted. So that's on the other hand. But I looked down on him and I said, poor fellow, you've got it.
بعد شهرين إلا إجا أبوي علينا نزل من ناحية الجبال وسقط على البلد ووصل للبيت لعنا ولقى البلد كله مهدوم. سقف البيت كله يعني هيك السقف بالأرض نازل مثل ما هو. كسر البطون ونشر الحديد وبحش الجورة، طال المرتبان الأزاز، كب المرتبان وحمل المصريات، حطن بعبه وطلع.
The human costs of 1948 were high. 6,000 Israelis lost their lives in the war, nearly 1% of the population. Records for Palestinian deaths were not kept, but historians have estimated them to be 2 or 3 times those of Israelis. In 1947, there had been between 500 and 700 Arab villages in the area that eventually became Israel. When the dust of the war settled, all but around 100 had been emptied of their population. 700,000 to 800,000 Palestinians had fled their homes, about 8 out of every 10 Palestinians who lived in the area that became Israel. For decades after the war, the Israeli government claimed that they bore no responsibility for the flight of the Palestinians. Many Israelis still make this claim.
We never wanted them to leave. Nobody told them that they leave the area or otherwise.
Don't tell me that nobody was forced to leave home. Everybody was forced to leave home.
There is consensus on the fact that there was a large-scale displacement of Palestinians. There is also consensus on the fact that this displacement was forced. Some people fled out of fear. Some people fled because there were massacres. Some people fled because rumors were spread about massacres. And some people fled because they didn't just flee, they were actually actively expelled at gunpoint. All of this happened. What remains is the question of whether there was a plan of ethnic cleansing that was designed ahead of time and then systematically implemented during the 1947 and 48 war. And on this question, historians are divided.
Now, the Arabs always maintain propagandistically it was a big expulsion. The fact is that most people simply fled the battle zones. In other words, the Jews attacked the militia bases, and during the attacks, or in fear of the attacks even before attacks occurred, Arabs began to flee.
I don't know how much hangs on this. Either way, the tragedy is clear. What historians do know, and that there is no doubt about, is that the war through which Israel was born was a set of events that, with the same breath, were the destruction of Palestine and the displacement of at least 750,000 Palestinians. That is uncontrovertible.
I think that when we talk about the refugee problem, it is not so much important whether we chase them or they ran away. It's not their fault that they wanted to run away. After the Iraqin and the fear of war, every citizen would run away. So it was not that they deserted their home. They did not desert. They were forced to leave because of the war. And in those places where they didn't do it, we chased them out, like in Lord and Ramleh.
You have to understand that, for instance, Jewish villages were spread all over the country, from the Negev to the Galil. You wanted to be connected, to make them one unit. But of course, everyone wanted to get more land.
The fact matters that these people were suffering tremendously as they were running away. Thirst and hunger, and in the great heat, children were abandoned. And then later in the refugee camps, when they came up near Ramallah and suffered for many years and are not terribly happy even today. That doesn't mean that I think that they should come back or not. As I full-heartedly agree that I would shoot at them if they come back in, say, October, November 1948, I don't think we will need to shoot at them, but Israel cannot afford to take back millions of Palestinians and remain what it is today, a state in which I want to live.
After the villages in Palestine were occupied in 1948 and the urban neighborhoods were taken, the new state of Israel decided to erase the Arab character of these places. And they did two major things. One was to plant forest over the debris and ruins of the villages. Pine tree forest that would give the places a European flavor and create recreational grounds there. And that they hoped would totally obliterate any memory of a village there. And the other one was to build immediately on the village a Jewish colony, quite often with a Hebrew name that resembled the Palestinian name, in order to say that this was originally a Jewish place that was depopulated by the Romans, actually, but never mind, but someone, and now is being repopulated and brought back to its rightful owners.
So the story that the Palestinians now make a lot out of, the 400 villages that lost their names, is a true story. From our point of view, it's only part of the whole story, which was basically a displacement of one nation by another, that laid off territories which were wide open for millions of immigrants that started to come in the 50s to the country and were settled in those lands.
The war came to an end in 1949. On the 11th of May, the United Nations formally recognized the State of Israel.
It was a feeling of creation.
הייתה הרגשת התעלות, בוודאי. שביתת הנשק, הקווים סוכרו.
The United Nations partition plan had allotted 56% of Palestine to the Jewish state. As a result of the war, the State of Israel now covered 78% of the land, all of Palestine, except an area around the west bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, and a small strip of land around the town of Gaza.
זאת אומרת, ההישג היה עצום, היה בלתי נתפס. איזה ארץ גדולה קיבלנו, או כבשנו, או הכירו בה.
But we couldn't be very happy and we couldn't be very glad because we lost all these people. And also, I don't remember us being very happy, but the Israelis who didn't fight, who were the parents and the parent generation, they were very happy because the families are now might come and there will be a state, but state is not always a great thing. Fighting for a state is much better than to have a state.
In the beginning, we were very happy about it, but after a short time, I started being not very happy. Where are they? The Palestinians. Are they coming back? Are not they coming back? What will happen now?
Here we have these two things intertwined with one another. The realization of a dream and the destruction of a society.
And the most horrible thing about it was when the war started and the Arabs were thrown out of their villages. Not one kibbutz said that they don't want to take their land. Not one kibbutz. Everybody was very happy to steal their land.
يعني أكبر من مأساة إني أترك بلدي وملكي وأرضي وبيتي وأطلع منه مشرد لاجئ. هاي أكبر مأساة.
Imagine yourself, if you are living in your home, suddenly you find yourself only with a shirt, nothing more. Your past is denied. They say there are no Palestinians. Nobody was living here.
לא היו אפשרויות רבות. זאת אומרת, זה היה או אנחנו או הם, זה ברור, כי אם הם היו מנצחים לא היינו אנחנו פה. ועשו, וכל נסיגה הייתה יכולה להיות סוף של מדינת ישראל, זה לא ש... אז זהו, אז אנחנו לא היינו, ידענו שהם מסכנים, שהם דפוקים, אבל חיינו עם זה. אני לא יודע אם כולם ידעו, אני ככה הרגשתי.
Refugees from the 1948 war and their descendants now number over 5 million. Many have spent their entire lives in the same refugee camps, in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. The tents have been replaced by concrete buildings, but living conditions have seen little improvement. Many of these camps have been struck by war over the decades, forcing some to become refugees 2 and 3 times over. Even now, many Palestinians have not laid eyes on their homes since 1948. But some have managed to find a way back, if only for a few hours. 6 decades after the war ended, Hassan Zubaydi became an American citizen and was allowed to visit his village as a tourist. He found only rubble. But others have found their villages still standing.
والله لو انك تشوف بلدي انا رحت زرتها والله تشوف بلدي جنة ساكنين فيها يهود اوروبيين نقاشين بيعملوا تماثيل وإيش من هالنوع. باجي بدي اطل على الدار اللي كنت ساكن فيها بقول لي شو بدك؟ قلت له هاي والله داري اللي كنت ساكن. كان لا داري ولا دارك، قال دار اللي بسكن. اليهودية بتقول لي اللي بسكن.
The Zionist movement was successful in establishing the State of Israel. But the dream of a safe haven for the Jewish people has not been realized. Since the end of the 1948 war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only grown more complicated and intractable. And the hopes, fears, and grievances that drove the conflict in 1948 are still central to the conflict today. Israelis build more and more settlements in the occupied West Bank, and Palestinians continue to be cut off from their homes and livelihood by military occupation, home demolition, checkpoints, curfews, and the construction of a wall that runs deep into Palestinian territory. As a result, Israel now controls nearly all of historic Palestine.
Here's the question. Was the establishment of the State of Israel so important that no matter what price Palestinians had to pay for it, it was worth it? Or was there something fundamentally wrong with a project that can only be realized by displacing hundreds of thousands of people? If the establishment of the State of Israel was a historic wrong, then the question now arises, how does one redress this wrong?
I'd like to invite Ahlam, Muhtaseb, and Andy Trimeltt up here. Welcome. Let me get these lights on. That's what they say on the table. Or... So, sorry, I can't see. Sorry. It's on. Okay. So I'd like to invite Ahlam and Andy to talk about the film, about their objectives in the film, and then we'll open it up to questions. And if you'd like to talk about the continuation of this process of displacement and how it... Can't hear you. Oh, I'm sorry. I said if you'd like to talk about the continuation of the process of displacement 75 years after the Nakba, that would be great. Let me move the table and you guys can sit comfortably. Would you like to sit behind the table or chair?
Do anything. Yeah.
We can even stand if you
want. And while they're talking, if anybody would like to ask questions, one of my colleagues is going to walk around with some index card, and you're welcome to ask for one, write down your questions, and we'll read the questions at the end of their discussion.
Can we turn on the lights?
Yeah. I think it's
I can see everyone.
Thank you.
Good evening. Yeah, I can see you all now. Well, first, thank you very much for watching the film. Thank you very much, Dr. Halakha, for inviting us and for all, the entities behind this event. We really appreciate it. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we are all here tonight are congregating on the indigenous, colonized, and ceded lands of the Komiai First Nation in what is known as San Diego, and that we are all continuing to benefit from this colonization. So if you don't mind, Andy, I could start and then you could take it later. So this film for me started from my years as a graduate student, and when I was at the University of Memphis doing my doctorate, I started thinking about Palestinian Nakba or diaspora stories and narratives, and the impact on a Palestinian diaspora community, in refugee camps, and how it impacted their collective trauma. So at that time, that makes a difference. At that time, I was interested in cognitive narratology and that kind of connection intergenerationally. So I started the actual work on this work and the field study in the refugee camps when I was a junior scholar at California State University, San Bernardino. And taking a social justice perspective, I decided to make a small-scale film, that could be used as a classroom resource. And I got some grants from a university. I bought filming equipment with, some limited, filmmaking skills, and I started my work first in Syria and Al Yarmouk refugee camp that doesn't exist anymore, actually. And then I went to Lebanon, and I worked for, I think, a week or 10 days, and then Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, and I was, I just couldn't continue. I was stranded for 35 days, came back, decided to go again, and get, other grants and go back and try again. In 2007, I met Andy, and Andy actually had a compelling story for wanting to work with me, but on a slightly different documentary. He wanted to focus on the year 1948, which was not my original focus. And he made, as I said, a convincing argument, which I will actually ask him to share that argument. That made me, work with him and change the direction of my original film's, story or focus.
So I got a bachelor's degree from just right here in town, SDSU, International Security and Conflict Resolution. And then I went up to University of Washington in Seattle, where I got my master's in Middle East Studies. And so throughout my education, I studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict multiple times. And by the time I had graduated, I understood, the facts and the figures and the moments in time you're supposed to know to pass the test and get an A. I knew, all those facts, but I still didn't get it. Like, I couldn't wrap my head around why are people still killing each other. And it wasn't until after I graduated and I started reading about 1948 that everything started to click for me. Everything started to make sense because I understood 1948. Not just the past, but also what's going on today, or what was going on then, which was home demolitions. You had building of the wall. You had all sorts of seizure of homes and taking over of land. And if you didn't understand what happened in 1948, you might think, for example, well, they're taking that home because those people don't have a permit. Of course they're going to take their home. But if you understand what happened in 1948, you realize that there is this decades-long process of taking land from one group and giving it to the other. And I realized that if I had gone through an entire graduate program and still wouldn't be able to wrap my head around this, how was the average person sitting around watching CNN or Fox News or MSNBC ever going to make sense of this? And so I said, someone needs to make a documentary, and no one else raised their hand, so it was us. We ended up, for this project, went through, we did 90 interviews in 7 different countries, 3 different languages. We did about 20,000 pages of research, collected 2,000 archival images, film clips, and documents. And then we edited that all down into the hour and 26 minutes that you just saw. When we started, I think we both knew it was going to be a very big project. I said to myself, this is the biggest project I've ever worked on in my life. I'm not going to be done until late next year. It was 10 years. It was a very long project. And the reason for that, there's many reasons for that, but one of the big ones is we really wanted to do the research and make sure that what we were presenting was reflected in historical documents, books, articles, etc., so we could back it up. We're not trying to tell some new story and some undiscovered thing. What we're trying to do is help people understand what the history says. And I hope that the last hour and a half has helped you do that a little bit.
I think the last part was to connect it to what is happening today.
I would like to have.
Yeah, because Andy mentioned some of that, this is kind of a primer for what is happening in terms of home demolitions, in terms of, bypass roads, in terms of the impossibility of a two-state solution, because of this constant, process of taking away lands from Palestinians and basically kicking them off or out. And that's actually now happening in Gaza. So, some people keep on saying in this country, self-defense, Israel is just trying to get rid of Hamas, etc. But at the end of the day, what they are actually doing on the ground in Gaza is a very clear, continuation of that process of, taking more land and ethnically cleansing or ethnically expelling the Palestinians off the land. And without maybe the intervention of some countries, Palestinians in Gaza, 2.3 million, would have been actually now probably in the Sinai desert. There were plans already. Israelis from day one were talking about, creating touristic attractions in Gaza, creating a port, etc. So that process was very clear, and it's continuing today. That now they are dividing Gaza into actually 2 main parts, and then dividing those parts into smaller parts like they did in the West Bank. And that's, again, to make conditions on the ground where it is impossible to talk about two-state solution anymore. And again, to drive as many Palestinians out of their lands as possible. So we can talk a little bit more once we have the questions, but that's just a quick connection. But this is very important to understand. When we did the film, of course, we didn't know this would happen, but when people, start talking about as if, oh, out of a sudden we have October 7, you see that actually this has been, people say 75 years, I would say 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, of this constant process of genocide against Palestinians that has been happening over years and years, different forms and shapes, and different campaigns culminating to what we are living today.
I have a few questions. Was that?
I'll start with you.
Okay, stay. And there's more questions coming. I don't know if we'll have time for all of them, but actually, if it's all right, I'll ask the first question. That's one privilege of organizing the stuff, is you get to ask the first question. As somebody who also has made some film projects, one of the interesting complexities is to, when you have historians speaking about history, from this sort of broad research, and then when you have witnesses speaking about personal experiences, there are two very different ways of looking at the world. There is very emotional, personal engagement with trauma, and then the other is much more kind of analytical, reflective way. How do you, I think you did a tremendous job with the film, balancing a very broad range of history, and you were remarkably ambitious, and I congratulate you on that. But there's this weird complexity of those very personal narratives and then the more sort of stable, quote unquote, stable historical narrative. How do you balance those two when you're making a film like that?
Do you want to start?
Sure.
I'll take it.
Yeah, I think
we have two different ways of looking at it.
we always have two slightly different ways of looking at it. I think one thing that we're really trying to do, and I talk about this all the time, is we're trying to make a documentary that is not just for academics, not just for activists, but is for the broader American public, because that's who really needs to understand this for anything to change. And so when I thought about what are we going to put in, what are we going to take out, because we had so much more content than what you saw. I mean, the first cut of this was 2.5 hours long, and I thought it was like, whoa, we got this down so good. So trying to figure out what you're going to include and what you're not going to include, I always thought about my neighbor, just average kind of white dude who lived across the street, who has no real connection to anything over there, but is generally interested in the world. And what does he need to know in order to feel like he has been properly informed on this? And so I think having a combination of personal stories and the hard history, you have all the historians explaining the numbers of the troops and the numbers of people killed, etc. I think is really important to convince that type of person. If you just come out with facts and figures, then you don't feel any personal connection to it. But if you have someone there who is telling you, I was personally kicked out of my home, I had people come to my house with guns and say, get out. That hits you, because everyone here can picture what that's like, being at their own home. And what would that be like if someone came to your house and said, get out? And the same way, we could say people showed up and they fired, guns and then they launched mortars. But if you have someone saying, I showed up at their houses, I fired rounds of ammunition at their direction, I fired mortars, and then we charged in. It's hard to say this didn't happen. That person clearly did it and doesn't have any concern about telling you about it. So we can't get into this argument of, oh, this isn't really true. So I think that's really what I was thinking about when we were trying to balance the stories and the history. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with your approach. I guess for me, I was trained as a typical social scientist. So for me, of course, evidence is usually the archives, the written word, right? But I had a journey of transformation into a decolonial scholar, and this is when I started appreciating the oral history tradition, the indigenous oral history tradition, and its importance actually in providing evidence, oral history as evidence. So they're not just stories, they are actually collective evidence of certain phenomena. In this case, of course, we're talking about collective trauma, we're talking about ethnic expulsion or genocide. And that transformative journey made me really want to center the voices of course, the Palestinian victims more than anyone else. But at the same time, I still wanted to, you know, as Andy said, you know, to provide more than just that and to provide as much archival information as we can get. The problem is, of course, that the archives are controlled by Israel. To a great extent, people don't know the extent which Israel is controlling the archive. And if you allow me, I could just take 5 minutes to talk about this very important issue. So Israel, after its establishment, they had the Israeli Information Act, or law, and according to it, they put an embargo on information related to anything around 1948 and the creation of the state. They set it at 50 years. So this meant that people couldn't see most of the information that was classified about the creation of the state until 1998. And that explains the emergence of, the new historians, Israeli historians like Ilan Pape, Avi Shlaim, and Benny Morris, whom we all interviewed in the film, who came out and basically introduced, a very dark side of, or image of the creation of the state of Israel that contradicted the formal Israeli narrative about its own creation, right? So, although Palestinian historians have been saying the same thing for years, but of course, when an Israeli historian comes up and says it, unfortunately, the world pays more attention to that. But anyway, so what happened because of this kind of, these revelations by the new historians, Israel went back and reclassified a lot of the information they declassified in the first place. Although they didn't classify everything, but whatever they classified. And there was a legal battle for years, actually, because, against that by some Israelis who wanted actually to dig in the archives, by some filmmakers like the filmmaker Shoshana, what's her last name? The one who did the film Born in Deir Yassin. Are you familiar with that? So she went to court and she tried to get more information, especially about Deir Yassin, and couldn't. Eventually, those scholars and those filmmakers and archivists, they lost actually the legal battle, and the Israeli government was able to extend the embargo until the year 2018, extending it for 70 years. And guess what? In 2018, everyone was waiting, but at that time, the Israeli government went back and extended it for another 20 years, so 290 years, which means we would never actually see the majority of archives until the year 2038. And so what you see in the film, if you think you've seen a lot, actually it's just the tip of the iceberg. We really don't know much about that history. So we tried as much as we can to make this combination between whatever we could get from the archives, from the historians, and from the people who lived through those experiences, the oral histories themselves.
I'll read a couple of questions. Actually, let me read them just one at a time. And I'm kind of just randomly, whichever's on the top. Where would you like to continue with this work or project? What do you want to do with it?
What do you want? Yeah, I'll let Eddie talk about what we're doing.
So, first and foremost, we want people to see it. And we actually, in October, decided we reached out to the distributors for the documentary, and we asked for permission to post it on YouTube. And so now it is available for everyone in the world to see without charge for the first time. So we're very excited about that. Please like, share, subscribe. And we're also adding content to our YouTube channel. So we have a number of the interviews that you saw in the documentary. We have the full version of the interview that you can watch if you want to check out the full interview with Hava Keller, for example. You can watch that on YouTube. We've also dreamed for a long time of having a website where people could go and see a map and then dive into the map and find stories based on where people live, and then really dig into their stories. And so we've never been able to pull that off, but a young woman reached out to us a couple years ago, and she has been interviewing Palestinians in refugee camps. And
Surely.
Yes. Noura Shuli. And she's been interviewing Palestinians in refugee camps, and literally just finished a Kickstarter campaign to build a website exactly like what I described. We're very excited. She's going to do that, and we're going to do our best to get not just her interviews in there, but also get our interviews in there. So we have a nice big archive where people can go and use them for research for years to come. Did I miss anything?
Just that we are trying to have as many interviews, like raw interviews, available to people as possible. That's something we're working on, but it's costly to hire an editor who would put the transcriptions over the interviews, especially the translated ones. And we don't have a budget. This is one of our challenges, has been a challenge, is of course funding.
Well, that's been my challenge too with the interviews I've conducted. I interviewed some of the same folks and many more. But the next question that pops up at the top here is, what was the pushback, if any, when you were creating the film? And maybe we'll extend that into now. Is there pushback?
Yes, that's the short answer. Honestly, when we screen to just an average American audience, which is our intended audience, especially those who are not necessarily informed, or maybe they know a little bit, or maybe misinformed, we don't have pushback. Actually, people always welcome the film, and they actually perceive it very well. And we get a lot of thank yous and a lot of appreciation. The pushback came mainly from the Israeli lobby in the United States, AIPAC, which stands for the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Political Action Committee, yes. And there are different arms in the United States, and they have many arms. And it's very unfortunate because they're trying to stop the screening through people who had never seen the film. So even before the film was known, or people didn't even know what the film had, they started trying to block us. And we had, several examples, but I think the three main ones that now it's much better in general, except after Gaza, but it has been a little bit less in the past few years. But the three main ones is when we released the first 2 years when we released. And it seemed like every time we had a student organization, doing a screening, they didn't pay much attention, they didn't care, but it was only when it was like official school entities like colleges and departments and centers that they went out of their way to block us. And the first one was on my campus, which was shocking, but we have the satellite campus in Palm Desert, and so we landed a screening there, and they started receiving like hundreds of letters from people saying, you can't let propaganda film, blah, blah, blah. And first they tried to force us to have other speakers, and I said, no, this is our platform. I'm not going to allow this. This is our platform. You can do whatever you want. I'm not going to prevent you from having any other panels, any other films. People can screen whatever they want. I'm not going to try to stop them, but don't stop me. Like, don't infringe on my constitutional rights or, end his constitutional rights. And eventually they allowed us to screen, and it was eventually a blessing because we went into the auditorium. It was bigger than this one actually, and it was packed with some angry people actually, to the extent just 5 minutes before the screening there was a guy, the AIPAC guy in Palm Desert, who introduced himself later to me and Andy, was trying to prevent the screening and trying to threaten the dean of the Palm Desert campus to cancel. And she said, have you seen the film? He said, no, and I was there. And she said, okay, let's all watch the film and then decide. So when we finished, a lot of people came and said, thank you, this was a great film. They told us it was propaganda, we were upset, but actually it's not, it's well done, etc. The second one was at UCI, and that's because 3 colleges...
And that guy, the guy who tried to stop us came to us and shook our hand.
And said it was a good film, same guy. He said, well, it is a good film, but I have reservations. But okay, we'll watch it first next time. But anyway, so UCI, because 3 colleges invited us and they had a reception, it was a very formal, like kind of big event. They received hundreds of emails and letters, and people also threatened to protest outside the train, so they didn't show up. Thanks goodness. Again, full house, well received. And the third big one, and that was the most stressful one, is the one at the city of West Hollywood. So we landed a screening as part of the Human Rights Speaker Series at the city of West Hollywood. And we were very excited about it. And they sold out, and this was supposed to be December of 2018, right? Yeah. And we were shocked that they canceled the screening. Somebody actually leaked an email to us from a rabbi in West Hollywood who hasn't seen the film, doesn't know us, who said many horrible things about us, especially me. Of course, they didn't attack.
Mostly about you, yeah. They didn't attack the white guy.
Yes, they didn't attack Andy. It was mainly me, the brown woman. So, so they canceled this thing when we pushed back, and even my university, even my, my provost and my deans, they protested. Like, it was so outrageous. Like, why would you do that? They said, oh no, we are gonna screen it, but we need to promote it more. And I was like, you sold out. Like, why do you want to promote it if you sold out, right? You don't have place for people. Anyway, they kept on rescheduling, canceling 3 times. And every time we pushed back, they said, oh, okay, we had this excuse and that excuse. And one of them was actually a sexual scandal of the former mayor. I'm like, okay. Eventually, they gave us the date of April 16, 2019. So great, but I was in South Africa. I came back and then I read in the WeWhoVille that has been publishing terrible stories about me, but then they changed. But I read that they were having a council meeting on April 2nd. In a last attempt to cancel the screening, they were trying to change the law and take away the scheduling from the hands of the city staff into the hands of the city elected officials, the city council members.
Because there was no way, somebody figured out that once a film was accepted into their human rights film screening series, the city of West Hollywood's law did not allow it to be canceled. So they literally attempted to change the law of the city of West Hollywood in order to stop our film.
Yes, and so there was a whole council meeting to change the law. So I went after a lot of reluctancy, because I knew it would be 3 votes against us, 2 votes for the screening. And I said, but anyway, eventually I went and I had some, friends and some supporters. Jewish Voice for Peace in LA, they mobilized some of their members and they went and talked. And I sat through 46 people saying terrible things about me, who don't know me, who hadn't seen the film. Most of them hadn't seen the film. They were just reading from a script that was delivered by, one of the arms of AIPAC. And then I was like, okay, that's it. I did my best. Like, I can't fight it anymore. But we were shocked that the vote flipped. 3 for the screening, 2 against for changing the law, to allow to either prevent the screening or not. And it came from one of the members who is actually Jewish herself, who wrote, at the beginning they quoted her saying same things about us, but then she decided to watch the film the night before. And she said, well, I watched the film, last night. Was it a hard film to watch? It was. Did it have a point of view? It had. Was it anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. Was it hateful? Absolutely not. I can't, I just pledged allegiance to the Constitution, and I can't break that, what else? Should I go upstairs and start burning books in the library? And that allowed the film to screen. We screened on April 16 to a full house and a long line of people trying to get in.
And a lot of protesters.
Thank you. So yeah, free publicity.
So, as part of the teach-in, we have a panel on censorship, March 20th.
You can talk about, I forgot to say that.
So next question is, thank you for being here with us. How did you select interview participants who were Israeli veterans or Palestinian refugees, and you already addressed it a little bit, but how did you navigate the way they relived traumatic experience during the interviews?
Excellent question. So I'll be quick about Palestinian refugees, and you can talk about the Israeli refugees. So I did only Palestinian refugees interviews, and for both Andy and I, we noticed that most Palestinian refugees wanted to talk about what happened to them. Although it was very traumatic and very heart-wrenching, but they felt like the world didn't know about this, and that was very important for them to be heard, to be recognized, to be visible, because of all the invisibilization of Palestinians in general, especially the refugees. With the Israelis, it was more complicated, and we decided from day one that, and so for me, the approach was like snowball sampling, basically. People who knew, and I kept on just having more recommendations for this person and this person, and I filmed in all of the Palestinian refugees in the city of Lebanon, Beirut. Wherever there was, for a whole month, 6 days a week, I filmed, from morning until we died, literally, me and my crew. So that was the process, whatever we could find an interviewee, we just went and tried to interview that person. But from day one, we decided that Andy would do the interviews, because I couldn't have any access to Israeli interviews, I forgot to say that, because of physical lack of access, because I'm Palestinian from the West Bank city of Hebron, which means I have a specifically designated Palestinian ID that the Israelis use to prevent me from crossing an imaginary line to the rest of historical Palestine, the 1948 areas, as they call it. So that's the physical aspect of lack of access, but also like Israelis wouldn't sit down with a Palestinian woman, with a Palestinian name. And I speak Hebrew, but they would immediately tell, like, my Hebrew is broken, and also I'm visibly Muslim. So although I'm white passing, they would immediately recognize I'm Palestinian. So we sent the white guy from San Diego.
So before I went over, I called up or emailed 2 Israelis, and I said I hired them as producers. They didn't know each other, they didn't work together, they were in different cities. But I gave the same request to both of them, which was find me people who remember 1948 and are willing to speak about it on camera. And then I went about, planning my trip and buying my ticket and everything. And both of them independently reached out to me about the same time, and they both said almost the same thing. They said, I don't think this is going to happen. And I said, why? He said, because every person we talk to says something we don't talk about. And I said, okay, well, I've already bought my plane ticket, so I'm going. Just keep trying and find people. And eventually they found some people who were willing to talk. I reached out to some people myself, and some of the more well-known folks that are in the documentary. Some of them said, I'll talk to you if you read my book. So I read their book. And I eventually went over there, and, some of the people I talked to, we didn't even put in the documentary. There were people who were really vague about what happened. They said, there was fighting. I heard about refugees, but I never saw any. I definitely wasn't a part of it, which might have been true. But it A, doesn't give you any clarity on what happened, and B, it's hard to verify that that's true. But there were people of varying political stripes who were willing to talk to me. And, I really appreciate people that are, open and honest and forthright about what they did. Like Mordechai Bar-On, he just said, this is what I did. This is how we push people out of the village. And we watched them go off. Hava Keller, she's the little tiny woman with the tiny voice. She talked about how she got a gun and she pushed people out of Beersheba into Gaza, and they're still there to this day. And those are the people that are being bombed right now. And so when, going back to your very first question, I think it's so important to understand that when at the beginning of our early October, when the Israelis said, "Hey, everyone in Gaza, move to the south, because we're gonna bomb just the bad guys, and then you can come back." They've heard this before. This isn't something they read in a history book. It's something that happened to their grandparents, who are still alive in many cases. And when you walk into a refugee camp, you'll see keys hanging everywhere. Those are the keys that people had when they left their homes for just a couple of weeks until the fighting was over. And so when they hear people say, "Oh, go somewhere else just for a bit and then you can come back," they don't believe it for a very good reason. And you can see that now. The last count, 70% of homes in Gaza have been destroyed. And there are more Palestinian refugees today than in all of history combined.
Thank you. The first part of the question. Can you discuss your decisions in sound editing to embed artillery or gunshot noises? It makes it feel like the viewer is there.
That's in. Oh, yeah.
So
sound effects.
I didn't make sound effects. Yeah, that was important to me. I have spent a lot of time watching Ken Burns documentaries, quite frankly, and that was very directly stolen from how he does his work. And I think it's important to feel like, if someone says, we fired on people, it's one thing to say it, but if you're also hearing it, you're really kind of feeling what it's like to be there. And I think it's so important to get that emotion. If you don't have the emotional connection, if you don't feel like you're there or feel a connection to the person that's talking, then you're not gonna remember what they said. The facts and the figures, you probably haven't memorized them right now, but you know the feelings, and those will not leave you. And so I think, and the other thing, just to nerd out on this a second, those weren't just random machine gun noises. Those were the specific machine guns that were used by the Israeli army, so and by Palestinian fighters. So there's Brent guns, those are Sten guns. Like, I wanted to make sure that they were legit.
He did a lot of research to get them right.
Besides paying attention to oral indigenous history, how else can you decolonize your higher education as a student and also as an institution?
Well, that's definitely a you question.
Yeah, we have a few days to talk about this. I actually, that's really a huge question and very complicated one. And if I really want to answer it the way I teach my students in some of my classes, it's gonna make some people angry, because when I teach, like decolonial approaches, for example, I critique a lot of universities and colleges, how can I say it, like whitewashing of the important work of decolonization by creating all these diversity, equity, and inclusion boards, and providing a very shallow image of how you actually do the work that should be decolonization, instead of just having this kind of like, oh, we're working on inclusion and diversity and equity, and we are doing all these boards and all these programs without real institutional structural change to academia. And that actually ends up really sometimes even hurting students of color or faculty of color. I mean, look at what is happening to us now because of Gaza. We are being attacked left and right, and actually people in positions of power historically, are using the same arguments against us and against people of color. I mean, look at also ethnic studies. It's not only about Palestine. That's why I said, like, don't have me start on this. But if you look at ethnic studies and the attacks on ethnic studies, critical race theory, etc. And so some of these programs literally were hijacked by people in positions of power, actually, to work against, the programs that were supposed to create real meaningful equity in institutions of higher education and in academia in general. And so we read some of the more radical materials on decolonization and how that might look like. And a lot of, like, What is frustrating is that a lot of these initiatives are not kind of controlled or enabled through the labor of people who are under the receiving end of inequity. And so people put programs without understanding. So like one way of that, I'm sorry, I'm really giving like larger arguments than just being more specific about certain things about Palestine or related, topics. But, one thing is to actually enable people in positions of an equity to change, to tell the university and the institution how that look like. What kind of programs are they looking for? But a lot of times, actually, institutions of higher education, administration, they run away from those more radical, solutions. They don't want to see that. They only want to do the lip service, again, of diversity inclusion. They have those token minorities, like myself. My university puts my image on posters and in videos, which is, okay, cool. But what else beyond that? Although I have to say that my university is much, much better than other universities. So I have to say that. They are not as repressive as what happens to some of my colleagues in other institutions. But that was like more of philosophical, answer to really reconsider how we look at the different manifestations of decolonization. It's a long road. I mean, it starts with acknowledging universities of their dark past, and start, doing active steps of for example, on indigenous lands. What do you do about that? How is fairness to indigenous populations? And let's talk about this institution in San Diego. How does it look like? Have you ever asked the tribes? How would that look like? What kind of atonement, what kind of, justice steps would you take to reverse the impact of history? I mean, look at also things like reparation in this country and how they are treated. Years and years of some of the most brutal forms of injustice, slavery. And I could go on and on, so I will stop here.
Well, I might have to go on and on because there's a question that follows up with this. And, sorry.
All right, do you ask?
I'll ask you. Says, as someone who studied conflict resolution, political science, how do you accomplish peace or any form of social justice with an extremist, far-right government and fail UN resolution? What choices is there than to fight for liberation? Is there any other option, diplomatic process that should be called for besides the right of return, etc.?
Do you want to try?
It's an easy one.
Okay. I'm going to give you another, more radical answer. So, for years and years as a Palestinian, I grew up never liking the word peace. But I never knew why. I had later to confront myself and say, why do I hate the word peace? Because I came to the realization that the word peace had been weaponized for generations to attack Palestinians and to take more lands and to continue with the genocide against them, to build more colonies, or as you call them, settlements, to build bypass roads, which are basically for Jewish use only, and all of these things. And then you weaponize the word peace and say, well, we're trying to have peace, Palestinians or not. And so it's very crucial when you hear people in demonstrations saying no justice, no peace. That's exactly what we should be demanding. I think if we demand justice and have justice, peace falls into place eventually and naturally. You don't have to work for it. Just work for justice and then peace comes naturally. Now the solution, right? Well, our government, our country holds the key to a solution. We are the ones blocking a solution. And if I want to get deeper, because I just don't want to throw out big words and that's it, we have different reasons for why the US government had never been interested in peace, honestly. We have no interest in this country, not Clinton, you can go as far as you want. No one had been genuinely interested in peace, and there are many reasons. Some of it are historical, some of it is religious in this country, but a lot of it has to do with the bottom line in a capitalist society, which is corporates, and corporates benefiting and profiting from wars. And that was very, very clear in Gaza. It was very clear from the second week of October when the Biden administration started saying we want to send $14 billion to Israel. Well, now they are 17, but at that time they were 14. And the $100 billion they wanted to send over to Ukraine and other places. He said, this is not a free giveaway. In a speech, you can find it online. This is not a free giveaway. It will help us replenish and renew our arsenal of weapons, stockpile of weapons. Basically, that's what he said. So the Israelis even should have also concluded that this kind of policy is also impacting them negatively. You know, because now we are serving the interests of all, you know, war profiteering. And that's not only when we talk about the military industrial complex, we're not only talking about weapon manufacturers, but there are many industries that benefit from war. You know, people who, I don't know, like send clothes and food to the army or whatever. You know, there are so many other industries, security industries, surveillance industries, Google, Amazon, I could go on and on. For people who don't want peace, and therefore they block any approach to real justice-based peace process. And unfortunately, the Israeli government doesn't care. I mean, if I were the Israeli government, I would actually care to have peace because it's gonna actually transpire to us. Maybe one day they would realize this and be serious about being fair to the Palestinians. I'm not sure. It doesn't look like it at all now, with all the genocide going on in Gaza. So I'm trying not to be pessimistic and to actually give you an optimistic, you know, perspective, but I think we have to do our role as citizens in telling the US government, no, we can't be servants of those corporates anymore, and we have to play, or not to play any role, maybe it's better at this point that the US government doesn't do any role. Because all they are doing is destroying any chances of real justice-based peace process.
So, a few things. One, I think it's important to understand, yes, there's an extremist government. Yes, it looks hopeless. But first of all, if there wasn't an extremist government, and there haven't been extremist governments, we wouldn't be here in the first place. So that's always what you're going to have when you're in a situation like this. And second, you know, when you read about conflicts throughout history, horrible injustice, oppression throughout history, at this point in the timeline, everyone always says, I felt like there was no hope, it's never going to happen. And we're always going to be oppressed. And you just keep pushing. All of them just kept pushing, and that's how it ended. So you can't just say there's nothing we can do, because Ahlam is right. We all of us in this room are in the best possible place to make a difference. All the other countries in the world are saying this needs to end now. You know, the Security Council just took a vote, and every country except for England, which voted abstain, every country said ceasefire now, and there was only one vote, and it was our own country against the ceasefire.
There was one little nation.
No, that was the ICJ. So yeah, then there's also the International Court of Justice is doing a trial right now to look at the occupation of Palestine. Same thing. Every country except two were supporting you know, the end of the occupation, and it was the United States and Fiji, which I'm guessing gets a little bit of money from us, that are supporting the Israeli side. And as far as like what does it look like? What does the end look like? I don't think any serious person is really thinking that the two-state solution is actually viable. You have in the West Bank over 500,000 Israeli settlers. And are you really going to tell those people that you're going to live under a Palestinian government and you have to do what they say? I just don't see how that's going to happen, and you can't push them off of the land. That's how we got here in the first place. So really, there's only been two solutions ever offered for this in the history for the last century. One is a two-state solution, which we've already tried. We just saw a documentary about that. And the other is a one-state solution. And you keep hearing people say, oh, from the river to the sea means we have to throw up, all the Jewish people. No, it means everyone gets equality. Everyone gets protection, equal protection. Everyone gets a vote. That's what it looks like if you have justice. Now, I'm not saying I would be opposed to a two-state solution, but what I do support is everyone has equality and equal protection under the law. That's the only way you get peace, and I do think we also need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to just, do what South Africa did, copy that model, and we'll get towards peace.
We need to dedicate the writings already. So this will be the last question. Why do you think Israel was okay with committing genocide against Palestinians, considering the Jewish Holocaust had just ended?
Ask them.
I'll answer. Just ask him, I'll answer. I'm a Jew. I'll answer.
He didn't say Jews, though.
Israel.
I'm from
He said
Israel.
Israelis.
Where's Israeli Jews?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't want him to answer.
Okay.
I want you to.
I actually, it has been very, very awkward for many people to understand this. From studying this for over 15 years now and listening to those stories, by the Israelis, and we have more interviews, by the way. Watching two films are very, very important. The first one is Born in Deir Yassin, and both of them are actually made by Israeli filmmakers. Born in Deir Yassin and Tantura. And they talk about two of the worst massacres in the history of the Nakba. And not because, the Deir Yassin is not the worst in terms of how awful the atrocities were, but it's because of how that massacre was weaponized to drive more and more Palestinians out. And so I listened to those interviews, I listened to the ones in Tantura, I listened to the ones in our documentaries, the ones we did not necessarily include. And I think it was mesmerizing to just witness the cognitive dissonance among those interviewees. That's how I understood it. That they found a way, those interviewees found a way of acknowledging what they did to the Palestinians, like Mordechai Ben Aur, when he said, shut up, Palestinian point blank, didn't feel any remorse. Because in his mind, it's okay. I have a dream, I have to protect myself, and it doesn't matter how. And I think many of them, that's the majority of Israeli society, think this way. Because I went through the Holocaust, because this happened to me, which we acknowledge in the film, we didn't shy away from it. That's absolutely a necessity. Then I have the right to do whatever I want. And now they are using Hamas to continue that logic. But at the end of the day, if you really dissect that logic, it's a logic of disposition, it's a logic of just an extension of colonial logic, really. That's what we are dealing with, which is justify the colonization of another nation, a typical European colonization of indigenous land. I have the right to do this, and I will do it, and here are my reasons, regardless of how the world might see this. I don't know if you want to say it.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't think they look at it that way, for one, and I think the thinking is that, horrible stuff happened to Jewish people all across Europe and Russia, and it's absolutely true. There were pogroms all over Russia, there was the Holocaust, all sorts of other anti-Semitic acts, discrimination, and so the thinking is, there's only one way we can be safe, and that's to have a place just for us, that no one else can, control, and we control, and that's the one way we can be safe. And the problem with that is, the place they chose already had people in it. And so if you're going to make this place some place that you control, there's only one way to deal with that, and that is to push them out. You have to do that in order to get this dream that you have. And that's the fundamental problem with Zionism.
I just want to add that in this process, of course, Palestinians are victimized twice. Because they are victimized by the actual, events and the actual like disposition and expulsion, but they are also victimized and that's why it's also colonial logic, because this is an imposition from Europe on Palestinians who had nothing to do with what was happening in Europe. So Europeans like Balfour, when we talked about the Balfour Declaration, they were not necessarily motivated by helping Jews. No, they were motivated by getting rid of what they called the Jewish problem in Europe. So they exported that problem somewhere else. Okay, great, we're going to colonize Palestine, so we could as well give it to them because we could claim the historical connection would allow for this. So that's also what people don't understand. We didn't have time in the film to talk about a lot of things. But one thing is that Balfour and other, European leaders, Balfour himself was actually a Zionist. He was a well-known Zionist, his writings, if you go back and read what he had written, you would conclude that. So for him, it was just only a solution for a problem he didn't want to have to deal with, which is very unfortunate. But again, Palestinians had nothing to do with any of that. On the contrary, they destroyed some of the best examples of coexistence in the Palestinian society, in the whole world, between the three religions, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, which still exist a little bit today for example, in the city of Hebron, descendants of some of the Jews in Hebron, including my family, because my family is actually a mixed family, and we have Jewish heritage as well. And in the city of Nablus and the West Bank, where we have the Sumerian Jews who still live as Palestinian citizens, and they have one representation, one parliamentarian in the Palestinian parliament. So I have some actually personal stories how this impacted my family horribly, this division actually, when we had, part of the family, Jewish members who were forced out of Hebron and were forced to go and live in Tel Aviv and other places and be detached from their extended family, Al-Muhtaseb family. It's a well-known story, actually. And he once read about it and called me and told me about it.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for the film. And not only for the creative work that goes into making such a complex film, but rather for the truth that it tells, for the truth that it insists that we listen to. And I hope all of us will leave here with a lot of questions thinking about our relationships as citizens of this country to what is going on in Palestine and Israel, but also to think about how we can address some of those problems through actions, whether just learning or other actions in terms of contacting your local representatives, talking to your teachers. Learning is the first step, but it's not the only step. I want to thank you for being here, and I want to invite you to come back next week on Wednesday for Dr. Jonathan Graubgard in this place, 4 to 6 p.m. And then on March the 5th, I don't know which place, for another film screening. And then on March the 12th for a panel discussion. And then on March the 20th for another panel discussion. That one will be on censorship. Thank you all for being here.